Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. Today I'm going to continue on with our series on mastering immunity and optimizing health. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is stress. The one thing that can probably single-handedly dismantle people's immunity, increase their risk for chronic illness, and destroy the quality of their life is stress. And this has been a larger pandemic than almost anything else we have seen in the world. It is global. It affects a vast number of people and much more than it used to. So we're going to break this down because stress is also a lot more than what most people think it is. And when we're looking at treating stress, there's much more than just trying to not feel stressed, which drives most people crazy when people tell you that. So we're going to break all these pieces down so that you get an idea of what needs to be addressed to really get out of this fight or flight cycle. So first, what is stress? Hans Selye was the famous physiologist who first introduced the term stress, and he defines it as the non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. Now, the prominent psychologist Richard Lazarus offers a similar definition, and he says that it's any event in which environmental demands, internal demands, or both tax or exceed the adaptive resources of an individual. So this definition of stress basically says that it is anything that challenges our ability to deal with it. And we are designed to be able to adapt to stress. The problem's really whether or not it is accumulating or we're managing it and burning it off and keep giving some buffer so that we can manage more and more. But if they keep building up, that's when we start to break down and have troubles. Now there's four big factors when we talk about stress. Now number one is blood sugar imbalances. Now these four big factors are all things that will activate the fight or flight nervous system, and long-term imbalances with this will cause ill health and disease. So number one is blood sugar imbalances. So think about it like this. Every time your blood sugar goes up and then comes back down, if it goes down too far, the primary hormone that helps to raise blood sugar back up is cortisol. And cortisol and adrenaline. And these are two of our primary stress response hormones. And when those things get active to try and raise blood sugar back up again, it will help to raise blood sugar, but it also puts us into fight or flight. And you'll see this a lot of times, people where they go into that hangry mode and their blood sugar, they crash and then they flip and they go right up again. And this can also create a whole bunch of problems with sleeping and mood and behavior and all sorts of things. So it's one that we're going to talk about and talk about what we need to do to address it. But blood sugar imbalances is really huge because it's something that goes on all day long, and it really is governed by when we're eating and how we're eating and what we're eating and all of those sorts of things. The next one that a lot of people don't think about is inflammation. Inflammation triggers a stress response. Cortisol is also an anti-inflammatory hormone. Cortisol being our primary long-term stress hormone, and every time we are under inflammation, we are going to be releasing cortisol. And there is a lot of different things that affect inflammation, and we're going to talk about those. Next thing is circadian rhythm disruption. So this is your sleep-wake cycles. When your sleep and wake cycles start to get disturbed, which is also epidemic, a lot of people are dealing with sleep troubles. Can't sleep at night, insomnia, they fall asleep, but then they wake back up again and can't get back to sleep. These are really big issues. And when that happens for a long period of time, again, it starts to create a lot of havoc with the fight or flight nervous system. And then the one that most people are aware of is perceived stressors. So these are the big things that we tend to be stressed about with work and relationships and money and health and all these types of things, and how they weigh on us. And we're going to talk about those too. So we're going to talk about these four big factors and how they interplay to basically create fight or flight and how that starts to create troubles with our immune system and our health. So, like I said, we are designed to deal with stressors. We are meant for it, for all sorts of stressors. The problem happens when we either lose our adaptive ability to manage them, so our coping skills are overwhelmed, or there's an accumulation of just too many or too frequent or such big ones that they've kind of blow us out of the water. And so I've got a picture here. If you watch this on the YouTube video, you'll see the PowerPoint lecture I'm going through here, but I think of it like this. I kind of have this background of waves, and then I have a fellow that's in the middle that's holding a big long list of stressors. So we've got things like bills and work stressors and health stressors and your diet and your kids, how much you exercise, your environment and the load that you might be under in your specific environment, your relationships and your amount of sleep and deep rest. All of these factors weigh in on how much you are getting to what I call your stress threshold. Every individual has a different stress threshold. And some of this is genetic, some of this is epigenetic. You will know some people that seem to just be really resilient. They can handle a lot of stressors and they roll with it, where other people, the slightest bit of stressors push them over the edge. Everybody's got some inherent capacity, but what we're really trying to figure out is how do we build more capacity, right? So I think of this sometimes like you could have two people and one person might be only at 50% capacity on how healthy they could be, and the other person might be up at a maxed out at 100 just because of what they've been given genetically. And they might be very similar. So the one person might be maxed out by doing everything right and functioning at 100%, where this other person who has just like great genetics and has a lot of adaptive ability, they might be riding at 50% and be equally performing, but the capacity that they have is so much greater. And so what we're always trying to do is figure out how do we build more capacity? How do we build more buffer? How do we build more resilience so that we can live life bigger and with more joy? So I think of it like this. We're always being inundated by these different stressors. But the thing is, how much are they building up and accumulating? And I think of this like the waves getting higher and higher and higher until we're basically immersed in the water and we're starting to drown. So if they get about a third of the way up, are we paying attention to that? Do we know what's going on? In my last lecture, I talked a lot about this functional zone of health. This is where your body is starting to speak to you. So when I get up to that 1/3 of the waves getting up, they're up around my knees or so, I should be starting to get some kind of symptoms. So whether those symptoms are I'm getting short with my family, or I'm more irritable or upset a lot of the times, or maybe I'm getting achy knees and an achy back, maybe I'm getting migraine headaches or just tension headaches more often, maybe I'm having trouble sleeping. All these different things are signs and symptoms the body is telling you that something's out of balance. And in my last lecture, and I think one before I did on building resilience, we talk a lot about that, and there's markers to look for that you want to track. So when I'm going through this stuff around stress, I'm thinking of it too. I would go through all the different areas of my life, and I would start to look at how intense those stressors are, even if I scale them on a scale of 1 to 3. And I'm like, okay, how am I doing with my financial stresses? How am I doing with my health stresses? How am I doing with my personal relationship with my partner? How am I doing with my relationship with my kids? How's my work? How do I find my diet? Exercise? How much am I moving? Am I getting a lot of proper sleep and deep rest? Basically, do an honest inventory of these things, and you can even shade in. I've got them scheduled up here where there's a lot of different ways. Just shade in. If you get a 3 on health stressors, then you shade in 3 bars. If you get a 3 on your relationship with your partner, shade in 3 bars. Before you know it, you're going to see that the level of the waves is getting higher and higher and higher, and it gives you just a visual interpretation of where you really are. Okay, because most of the time we're really good at just trying to get things day to day and move through our life without really stopping to pay close attention to what's actually going on so that we can make the changes that we need to make. And then if that bar is getting up to being 2/3 of the way, we're almost up to our neck now in these waves, we should be getting even stronger symptoms from the body. And again, if we're paying attention to it, then we can start to narrow down what we need to do to correct it. But if we're not, before long, that third wave's going to hit, we're going to be immersed, and then we're going to feel like we're drowning, and that feels like we are just completely overwhelmed, and now we have lost almost all abilities to manage our stress and really manage our world. Everything's just overwhelming. So let's go through each one of these top big four. Let's talk about blood sugar imbalance. This is something that is not new to people. It is a massive, massive problem within the whole world. Diabetes, pre-diabetes, insulin resistance. This is what I'm talking about. Now that's sort of getting towards more the end stage when we're now in a full-on disease when you start to have something like diabetes. But you can get a lot of these symptoms and ramifications of imbalances with blood sugar well before it ever becomes an actual disease. So the things that play into this would be refined carbohydrates. So when I'm talking about refined carbohydrates, that's like white flours, right? For the most part, it's really processed grains for the most part. So processed grains, just all of the stuff that buffers some of the blood sugar and buffers the release of sugar into your blood has been taken out. So the fiber has been taken out, a lot of the nutrients have been taken out. So they tend to spike blood sugar very quickly. And in some literature, you'll see that certain grains can spike blood sugar just as fast, if not faster, than plain white sugar can. So you could have a piece of white bread and it'll often spike blood sugar even faster than white sugar will itself. So it's pretty amazing at the effects that refined carbohydrates have. And that's one of the biggest reasons for this huge problem with diabetes, is that there's way too many refined carbohydrates. Now, another thing that a lot of people don't think about is excess protein. Now, protein can be a double-edged sword. Too much of it will cause blood sugar problems because protein just gets broken down into sugar. But not enough of it also creates problems because we need a certain amount of protein to stabilize our blood sugar, because it tends to take a little bit longer time to break protein down into sugar than it does carbohydrates. So proteins are generally a fuel that we use to buffer blood sugar for us when we're needing to slow down the release. But too much becomes a problem and is also related to diabetes. Any cortisol spikes. So cortisol spikes would be when we get in fight or flight mode. So when we're getting worried, or we're pensive, or we've got anxiety or something along these lines that's spiking our cortisol levels. That creates blood sugar imbalances, because blood sugar, when cortisol goes up, blood sugar spikes. But then not too long blood sugar, then that causes a big insulin surge, and insulin pulls blood sugar right back down again. And this is the problem, that a lot of people end up on this roller coaster ride with blood sugar all day long. And it can create so many troubles with your mood and how you can regulate stress, because you're just in this up and down mode all day long. This was one of the biggest problems with my stepson which we found out, for just mood and behavior. If his blood sugar was low, he was what we would call hypoglycemic. He was completely a bear. You could not talk to him about anything. There was no sense in trying to have any conversation about anything until we got some food in him and got his blood sugar a little bit more stable. Then we were able to have a bit of a conversation. Now, it's tricky enough with teenagers to try and be able to have a conversation with them anyways. But a lot of times there's these physiological things in the background that are just adding fuel to the fire. Another marker that we have to look at is obesity. Obesity is one of the biggest reasons for type 2 diabetes. It's really essential to manage weight. And now that can be a mix of things, because a lot of times people that are getting too heavy also are having troubles managing their blood sugar. But most of that comes back down to diet stuff. Now, the best measurement you can do is looking at a waist to hip ratio. And I'm not going to go into all of that in this lecture, but go back to the Building Resilience lecture, and I talk about some of the main markers, and there's a free download in the show notes for that episode as well. And it's got all of those different sheets that you can use to track your symptoms, and these markers are determinants of health that I talk about. But getting your hip to weight ratio, your hip to waist ratio optimized is an excellent marker for longevity. It's an excellent marker for decreasing risk of diabetes. Lack of fiber is another problem, and this ties in a little bit with the refined carbohydrates, because we get certain fiber from carbohydrates that are whole food carbohydrates, but they are stripped out when we have refined carbs. So if you're going to have carbohydrates, try and move more towards whole food carbohydrates. And fiber is also in our fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables can both be great. Vegetables are often missing in most people's diet. The vast majority of it's hard to get the amount of vegetables that we should be intaking. So I always suggest try and throw them in wherever you can, even if you do things like smoothies once in a while, throw in some different greens and whatnot. Try and get your veggies in different ways as much as you can. But fiber is a great buffer for blood sugar. It slows the release. Generally, the things that really slow the release for blood sugar would be adding fibers in, adding some protein, but not too much, and adding healthy fats. Those three things are your biggest factors that will slow the release of sugar. Another problem is just too much sugar. Everything just keeps getting more and more sugar added to it. If you've ever done a challenge where you've taken sugar out for a week or two, and then you go back to eating some of the things that you used to have that were high in sugar, you're astounded at how sweet they really are. We basically get desensitized to sugar as we go along. And especially in North America, I've been to other countries where I have something that has sugar and it's significantly less sweet than what I'm used to having out here if I have it. So I think North America in general keeps upping the ante with how much sugar they're putting in things. So absolutely try and take particularly refined white sugars and refined brown sugars out. If you're going to use sweeteners, your better sweeteners are to move towards things like a little bit of honey or a little bit of coconut sugar. And then some of your alternative sugars that are still good would be things like some stevia or a little bit of monk fruit sweetener or even xylitol. Those things can be good alternatives that won't affect your blood sugar very much. Improper timing of food. Some people are very sensitive to when they need to eat. Some people need it right away when they wake up in the morning, or else they cannot get feeling okay. And if people wait too long, their blood sugar will crash. And often when people are initially having troubles with managing their blood sugar, they are very sensitive to the timing of their meals. When people begin to become very fat adapted, meaning that their body can access fat for fuel more efficiently, you can usually go long periods of time without eating. This is where you can fast for chunks of time and you don't really feel bad at all. You actually feel really good in a fasted state. But initially, a lot of times people can't do that and they may need to eat very frequently first just to try and keep their blood sugar in a good zone. And as they're changing their diet so that it's not having spikes and crashes so quickly, then they build up where they can start to then stretch the timing of their meals farther apart. And then they're usually fine with 2 or 3 meals a day without having to have snacks throughout the day or grazing throughout the day. Now, ultimately, neither one is necessarily all good or all bad. What I've learned over the years is that everything is very individual, and some people just do very well on a 2 meals a day with an intermittent fast. Other people do really well grazing. So the key with all of it is, regardless of what I tell you, I'm going to give you my experience on things, but you need to ultimately try it and see what works for you and be able and willing to modify things if they're not working and you're not getting the results you want. Another big factor for blood sugar imbalance is exercise, and particularly lack of exercise. Exercise is a great modulator for blood sugar. Hormonally, it affects a lot of things that help to manage blood sugar. It's an essential piece of the overall picture, and it doesn't have to be incredibly hard exercise. A lot of it's just incorporating more movement, and I'm going to talk pretty soon about what that actually means and what you can do to start to get back on track. So some of the big solutions for blood sugar, and again, like I said, there's lots of ways to do this. I've seen people manage their blood sugar eating a paleo kind of a diet. I've seen people manage their blood sugar very well doing a ketogenic diet. I've seen people do a more of a Pritikin type of a diet, or a more of a whole food kind of a diet that incorporates higher amounts of complex carbohydrates. They can all work, but they don't all work for every single person. So this is where all these diet battles come back and forth, is it takes away the individuality. Some people just do better on some diets than other ones, but I've seen people lower their cholesterol on all of those different diets. Ones that are told that they're going to increase their cholesterol, lower it. So you've seen it enough. I've seen it enough times where you just have to try some different things. So the one that I find works well initially for a lot of people, and you might have to balance it out a little bit for you, but I find if people have blood sugar issues, what I always want people to try and do initially is start to add in a little bit more higher healthy fats. So add in a little bit more olives, a little bit more very clean olive oil that's raw, meaning you don't cook with it. Adding in a little bit more avocado, maybe some coconut cream or coconut oil, and maybe a little bit of cocoa butter. If you eat eggs and you're not sensitive to them, egg yolks can be very good as well. But those are some of the classic higher fats that tend to be very beneficial for the body. I would start to move my carbohydrates just lower. I would get rid of refined carbohydrates completely, and I would start to move and take my carbohydrates now more from vegetables. So if you can, you try and move more towards incorporating maybe a little bit more of the lower glycemic index vegetables, like maybe sweet potato and yam, as opposed to having just white potato for a little bit. And again, that shouldn't be very much, but you want to keep those down, but you still want to have some carbohydrates in because you need them most of the time. But you don't need lots of them if you're trying to balance out your blood sugar. And then the goal is ultimately, if you're testing it and getting it checked, you're looking to see if it's working, and then you start to add more and more stuff back in to figure out what do you need to keep you in a good zone. A strategy that I really like to incorporate is called intermittent fasting. If you've listened to me long enough, you've heard me talk about this. I found this was a really great one for me and for many patients. Now again, not everybody, and if you are under high stress, intermittent fasting can be challenging on your adrenals. So you have to see ultimately if it's working or not. But from a blood sugar standpoint, intermittent fasting can be a very great strategy to get your body to become more fat adapted, meaning you're training your body to use fat for fuel as opposed to carbohydrates for fuel. So I think the easiest way is doing a 6 to 8 hour fast with is basically doing a 6 to 8 hour fast, and then, or sorry, I think the best way to incorporate intermittent fasting is to basically have about a 6 to 8 hour window with the rest of the time fasting. So you would be fasting for 16 to 18 hours, and you would be eating for 6 to 8 hours. Most people can do that. That usually means skipping breakfast in the morning and then just having more of an earlier lunch and then an earlier dinner. And if you can do that and you can start to move towards that, even if you try it once a week and then try it twice a week and just see what happens. But there's a lot of information, a lot of research showing the benefits of that with blood sugar balancing. Increasing fiber. I think the easiest way is trying to bulk up more of your vegetables. That's probably the best way to try and get your fiber in. And outside of that, because we're not usually doing a lot of grains, then you could even do a bit of a fiber supplement if you wanted to, just to bulk up a little extra fiber. You can incorporate prebiotic fibers like inulin, or you can do a bit of a bulk fiber that is got a little bit more things like guar gum and psyllium husk and stuff like that. And just see how it feels. Fiber sometimes can really help with things like bowel movements, but sometimes too much fiber can cause a bit of constipation. So again, you have to work with your practitioner to know what the right blend is with all these things. I'm not giving you specific dosages on everything because that's something you need to figure out, and you need to work with someone because everybody's case is individual. And the other part around blood sugar management is exercise. And I think the easiest way to start it, and this is a equation that I think works really well, and I talked about this in exercise with fat loss in another podcast I did back earlier on, that you'll see on the website. But the ratio is, you want to calculate this out, and it's 180 minus your age is your max aerobic heart rate. So 180 minus your age. So if I were 40 years old, I'm actually 47, but if I was 40 years old, then it would be 180 minus 40. So my max aerobic heart rate would be 140. I would not want to go above 140. And often I would even suggest minus it again by another 5 beats just to be on the safe side. This was a equation that was established by an exercise physiologist named Phil Maffetone, and he broke this down as being your max aerobic heart rate. So when you get into this zone, your primary fuel that your body is going to use is fat. So it's a great way to get your body to start to get used to burning fat for fuel, and you're training it to get into that zone. Now, the key is that often if people are really out of balance, it can take about 2 months of doing this on a regular basis. So you might go out for a 45-minute walk. Most of the time it's a walk. You're usually actually exercising in a much lower intensity than you think you're going to. And you would go for that. You would track your heart rate. And you'd be looking to make sure that you don't go above your 180 minus your age, minus probably even another 5 beats. Even if it doesn't feel like you're working out very hard, don't worry about it. Just walk. Stay at that zone. If you start to speed it up a little bit and your heart rate's starting to go up a beat and another beat and another beat and you're getting close to your max heart rate, slow back down. Do not go above that max aerobic heart rate. And if you can do that for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour daily, because it's not hard exercise, it really is just going and moving your body for a period of time. And you will definitely start to see that change around. You'll get your body starting to become fat adapted. And this often helps with a lot of people on getting back into being able to burn fat. Because a lot of people, when they're under high stress, and cortisol's high and insulin starts to go high, your body goes into storage mode. And so what's so frustrating is then you're going and working out hard and it's not working. You're not burning any fat because your body is stuck in storage mode. So even if you were working out hard and doing the exercise, you can't access that fat to burn. So sometimes we have to do something very different to retrain the body so it can actually use that source of energy again. And that's a great system. 180 minus your age, go for walks. Walks is probably the best way to do it. Okay, number 2 on the hit list is inflammation. Inflammation is so common nowadays. I find almost everybody has inflammation. And if anybody listened to the episode that we just did with Dr. Jaffe, he talked about some of the markers that we use, these predictive biomarkers for health. And inflammation markers were one of those big ones. Checking something called a high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or an HSCRP, is a great measurement for inflammation in the body. We also check something called an ESR, which is an erythrocyte sedimentation rate. That's a good marker for inflammation. Those are generalized markers. So if someone had something like rheumatoid arthritis, those markers are really high. And we use them as a marker to see if we can get them lower and lower and lower. And usually as that comes down, people's pain also comes down. So when we look at inflammation, why are we under so much inflammation? Well, a big part of it is inflammatory diet. So how we eat often creates inflammation. I mean, it's information, right? What we take in from food is information, and if that is not very good information, it's going to create inflammation. Our body knows what to do with whole foods, but when we start to manipulate foods in lots of different ways, I think our body runs into a little bit more troubles with it. I think that the body's capable of adapting to that type of thing over time, but the amount of change that's happened in our food system has been so dramatic over the last probably 50 years that it often takes hundreds to thousands of years for our bodies to evolve and adapt to significant changes. And we've really significantly changed and adulterated the food industry over the years. So some of the big ones, if you want to explore with it, I would say the biggest foods that usually come up for people for inflammation, they're bad rancid oils. So a lot of our vegetable oils are garbage. I would try and take them out as much as you can. I try and get your fats from natural sources that are clean. I would use clean olive oils, and I wouldn't cook them. I wouldn't superheat any oils as much as I can. If you're going to cook with any kind of fat, your best cooking fat is probably ghee, or also known as clarified butter. That tends to be very heat resistant, so you can go quite high. Avocado oil is also better oil to cook with. But outside of that, I really would try not cook with oils very often. I would try and use, like Dr. Jaffe talked about in his thing, he uses red wine, he uses bone broths, he uses different things like that to cook his foods. That's a much better alternative. Some other foods that sometimes can cause triggers for inflammation for people that are susceptible are the foods called our nightshades. And they're a part of a family called solanaceous. And these are primary ones would be things like eggplant, potato, tomato, bell peppers, and paprika. Some people just have troubles with them. They have a constituent in them called solanine, and some people react to that, and it creates a lot of inflammation. I think up to about 20% of the population, possibly. So it's not necessarily you have to always be off it, but if you've never tried it, pull them out for a while and see what happens. Outside of that, some of the big food allergy ones would be taking out gluten or taking out grains for a period of time. I find that triggers a lot of people's inflammation. Taking out dairy for a little bit, those are also common ones. Pulling out your sugars. Like if you do that and you try taking nightshades out, you might be really astounded at how much stuff changes in how you feel very quickly. And when inflammation is high and cortisol is high, you got to remember that cortisol, when we are under stress, high cortisol is immune suppressant. So when you're under stress, your immune system is naturally being suppressed. So any of these things that are triggering stress hormones is going to weaken your immune system and increasing your risk for chronic disease. So all of these things are, where do we need to take our body? What do we need to get rid of so that our immune system naturally gets stronger again? So inflammatory diet, food allergies. So we just talked about that. Big food allergies, gluten, a lot of grains in general, dairy, soy, sometimes our citrus. Eggs you might try either. Otherwise, I think eggs are generally very good for most people, but some people are quite sensitive to them. Those are all some of the really big ones. Refined sugars. If you take those things out, if nobody's ever done that, try and do an elimination diet, like to pull them out for like 30 days and then systematically bring them in one at a time over a few days and just see how your body feels and then what it feels like when you start to bring them back in. Food allergies are not hard to check. The problem with food allergies is that I think of food allergies like tacks in your shoe. So you might pull out one tack, but if you've got 5 tacks there, your foot still hurts. So a lot of times you have to pull them all out, let things just start to heal and get feeling a bit better, then put them in one at a time again to see which one's really giving you the most problems. Hidden infections is another big cause of inflammation. Now, I've got gut infections on my PowerPoint slide, but I would also put teeth infections. That's another big one. And a lot of work by Dr. Jerry Tennant really emphasizes you almost need to see a good holistic dentist before you even see your doctor around this work, or your functional medicine doctor, or your integrated medical doctor, your naturopathic doctor, who will work with these things. But gut infections, which are hidden, which sometimes we can figure out from signs and symptoms, and a lot of times we need to do some sorts of functional medicine testing to see what's actually going on there. And teeth infections are not uncommon at all, and they can be really tricky sometimes, because if people have had a lot of root canals, it's not uncommon that there are low-grade infections in root canal teeth. And it can be very hard to sometimes notice them because you don't always get symptoms, but it can be this slow leak literally into the body that can be creating a lot of troubles. If you can look up Dr. Jerry Tennant's work, and you'll see a lot of information around the problems with root canals and with teeth infections. Obesity, we talked about obesity again. Good measurement, waist to hip ratio, fine-tuning everything I'm talking to you about with diet and exercise is a great way to start to address obesity. But as you gain more and more weight, you tend to increase inflammation. Also, we tend to get insulin resistance, and as insulin rises, that's also related to inflammation. Autoimmunity, this is a big one. There's more and more autoimmunity. This is when we talk about conditions like MS and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease, and some of these different things that are more autoimmune, where the body's immune system seems to have gone awry. Balancing out autoimmunity, again, can decrease inflammation substantially. So some of the big ones, again, avoid food allergies. Try it. Go 30 days. I am constantly astounded and amazed at how much foods affect people. And if we have the willingness to remove certain things for a chunk of time and just see totally open to it. Don't be surprised if you feel really shitty for the first little bit, because you're often addicted to a lot of these foods. They create chemical, like when you look at things like gluten and dairy, they create things like what are called caseinomorphins and glutinomorphins. They're literally like an opiate-like a substance that attaches to receptors, and you will go through a bit of a withdrawal, almost like a detox, when you stop eating those foods. So don't be surprised if you take wheat or dairy out for a bit and you feel crappy for the first while. That's not uncommon. But it's almost like if you were getting off of being addicted to sugar, or being addicted to smoking, or being addicted to heroin. All the same sort of idea. As you start to go off of it, you don't feel so great sometimes right off the bat. And the more addicted to you are, you often have a hard time. But you can also get through it quite easily if you're not overly addicted to it and your body is adapting pretty well. But just try it. Try and go for a little while. Go for about a month of just taking these things out, eating a really whole food, clean diet, and then see what changes. Balancing essential fatty acids is another big marker for inflammation. So this was again in the recent episode with Dr. Jaffe. One of their markers was looking at omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid balance. So when we talk about fatty acids, we've got all these different fatty acids, and the big ones we usually talk about are omega-3, which we think of with fish oils, and from a plant perspective, usually more like flax and sometimes hemp, and then we look at omega-6s, which are most of our other seed oils. Okay, and we need a balance with that. I'd say it varies from person to person and on what they say, but often somewhere in the range of like a 2 to 4 to 1 ratio. So 2 to 4 times more omega-6 to omega-3. But the problem is that most people are, up to 20 to 50 times higher in omega-6s than they are to omega-3s. And one of the things that we get asked is, can I balance it out by taking flax oil? Because flax oil is the first step of omega-3, but ultimately, flax oil is something called an ALA, and then that has to be converted to what's called an EPA and DHA, which is the type of fat that's in fish. And then from that, that gets converted into specific anti-inflammatory prostaglandins, which tend to be very beneficial. And the problem is that most times the flax oil does not convert very effectively over to EPA DHA, which is why most people say that you usually need to have freshwater clean fish or a very clean fish oil that does not have, or that's been tested by third parties to have what they say is in it and to not have metals and whatnot too, which can be an issue. But balancing out fatty acids is really important, because if that's out of balance, we tend to create too many inflammatory prostaglandins and not enough anti-inflammatory prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are just like a hormone that helps. And we need both, but we need them in the right balance. So I'll often do a test too where I will check a fatty acid ratio on people to see. And almost everybody is completely out of balance unless they regularly take fish oils. And for my patients that are vegans out there that choose a vegan lifestyle, that's one of the inherent imbalances that they have to be careful with. Some people I've seen thrive well on a vegan diet. Some people I've seen crash and burn on a vegan diet because it is a very restrictive diet in some ways. It also can be great because you're incorporating a ton of vegetables and stuff with it if you're being a well-balanced vegan, if you're choosing a well-balanced vegan diet. But one of the problems is that even when they're taking a lot of flax and different oils, when I run this test on them, I have not seen one patient yet that has a full vegan diet that has not been lower than 20 times higher than what they should be. I shouldn't say 20 times higher than what they should be. They should be around 2 to 4 for omega-6, and they are up past 20, anywhere from 20 up to about 50 times. So it's one of those inherent imbalances that I just don't see people do very well. Sometimes you might be able to move to an algae oil, but like Dr. Jaffe said, that's primarily a DHA, and you need to have both the EPA and the DHA. Another strategy for inflammation is incorporating some of the intermittent fasting that I talked about and a little bit more of a higher beneficial fat diet. Try it and see how you feel. Remove underlying infections. So that means you need to work with somebody to figure out some of these things. Do you have some underlying infections that have been sitting there for a long time? Just ask, how's your gut health? Do you have regular heartburn? Do you get a lot of gas and bloating? Do you have constipation or diarrhea? Any of these type of things. Do you get any gut pains? Any of this type of stuff often means there could be underlying issues, whether that's an infection or if it's low stomach acid or if it's pancreatic deficiency. It could be a lot of things, but they need to be checked out if they're out of balance. And then again, exercise at that 180 minus your age. That's your max aerobic heart rate. That's a great way to start to lower inflammation as well. All right, third one on the hit list, circadian disturbances. So lots of things that cause troubles with sleep-wake cycles. And I would say some of the biggest ones can be just stress. People are just stressed all the time. They can't get out of that mental chatter and that fight or flight mode. But outside of that, there's lots of things. Jet lag. If anybody's ever traveled, they often have troubles getting their system back on track. I know when I've traveled out to like Bali or Hong Kong or out in that way, and they're almost 12 hours different. So when I've come back, it sometimes takes a while to get back on track. I find things like melatonin can be really beneficial for that purpose, and that's almost what they were originally used for, to help get your sleep-wake cycle back on track. Grounding, walking barefoot on the ground, and also getting back into cycles of light and dark. You in we need to be in sync with our environment. So when our skin receives UVA and UVB and these different rays of light, and when they go into our eyes, when we are exposed to light, that helps to set our circadian rhythm. So you need to get up in the morning, and even if you've had trouble sleeping, it's like you need to get up in the morning and get exposed to light. And then you need to try and follow those cycles in the evening as well. So I would have lights on dimmers. I would never have lights on full in the evening. When it's summertime, like right now, I wouldn't even put lights on. I would just follow the natural rhythms of the planet. So it's, if wherever you are, you leave the lights off, and as it starts to get darker, then you just don't turn lights on. Go to sleep. Um, Shift workers have a lot of troubles with circadian rhythm. If you have ever been pregnant, you know that that can create lots of different troubles. Structural stuff, musculoskeletal issues, things like that. Aches and pains can cause troubles for people with sleeping. A number of medical conditions can cause lots of troubles, and also medications that they're on can often affect your sleep-wake cycle. So that would be something to even check with your doctor as well, depending on which medications you're on, if there are certain things that cause sleep troubles. I was just looking at this at one point here. Let me just pull something up. So on here, medications that can affect sleep. So we're looking at antiarrhythmics and beta blockers and high blood pressure meds, corticosteroids, diuretics, stimulants, medications for cough, colds, and flu, anything that we would use for headaches and other pains that usually contain caffeine. Nicotine replacement products, sedating antihistamines, antidepressant medication, anti-anxiety medication, stimulants that are used for attention deficit disorder, medications for hypothyroidism and asthma. There's a whole ton of things. This was all looked at by Harvard Medical School, breaking down some of the big medications that can cause troubles with sleep and wake cycle. Because if you're having troubles with sleeping, sometimes that can be a rate limiting step. If you are on a medication and you're trying to do everything you can to fix it, and it's a side effect from the medication, it needs to be adjusted. Some other big ones would be the lights at home. So blue light from your screen. So I know with my kids, my 2 and my 4 should not really have any screen time. Sometimes that's hard to avoid if there's with grandparents and some stuff like that, but as best as we can, you try not to have screen time for kids. And even for my teenager, past 7 o'clock, it should be no screens. It really should be. The blue light from the screen starts to screw up your sleep and wake cycle. And 100% do not let your child go to bed with a tablet or a computer or a phone, because I guarantee you they are addictive and they will be on them until much later than what they should be, and they're going to screw up their sleep and wake cycles. And the other thing is just too much screen time. Screen time by itself, just again, because of this blue light exposure, that's a big thing that starts to screw up people's sleep and wake cycles. So again, try and get back into the natural rhythms of the planet. Get outside, get exposed to the sun. When it starts to get dark, let it just start to get dark. If you have lights on dimmer so you can dial them down as the light is going down, so that it's a natural transition to then go to bed, rather than everything being super bright to then shutting it off and then trying to get back to sleep. Now, the other thing, the fourth one, this is the one that most people are aware of when we think about stress, and this is perceived stress. So this is when we have that negative future fantasy spiral that gets going when we start working about stuff, that mental chatter that we can't stop. We wake up in the middle of the night, and as soon as you wake up, just like that, your head's starting to spin again, and you can't get out of that cycle, because when you start to think about stressful things, you will start to release more stress hormone. You release adrenaline, you release cortisol, and now that's starting to wake you up. And the constant stress hormones that come from that can be immense, because if we are really taking a check-in with our self-talk and the thoughts that are going on in our brain, if that's going on all the time, that's a hit of stress hormone all the time, all day long, that we just can't get out of. Now, this ties into things like negative past experiences that we're having troubles letting go. It can be lamenting or ruminating over things that we wish we did different. It ties into guilts and all sorts of different stuff. And this is paramount because I see this with people all the time. And I would say this is a big piece of almost everybody's health history. And one other aspect that I've done a lot of work with now is the biochemical piece to it. Some people also have biochemistry that is causing their set point for stress to be much higher than what it should be. So some of the big things could be when I'm checking something like a metal metabolism issue where they might have high copper with lower zinc. That imbalance, high free copper, causes a conversion of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that causes you to focus and seek pleasure situations and feel good. And it causes it to convert over into norepinephrine, which is more of like a stress hormone. So some people can have biochemical pieces that cause them to feel stressed. It's almost like they've already had a few too many cups of coffee that's causing their body to just feel jittery all the time. And then when the body feels jittery, it can then cause you to start to think stressful thoughts. And then when you think those stressful thoughts, you get sucked right back in, and it creates this big loop of creating more and more stress hormones. So one thing we're always checking now is I check certain biochemistry to make sure that you're not have this added monkey on your back that's causing stuff that shouldn't really be there, because those things can be balanced out by nutrient therapy. And this is a lot of the work that Dr. William Walsh had done with the Walsh Research Institute around things like anxiety and depression and ADHD and even things like schizophrenia and different aspects of mental health. But I find it's actually very common for a lot of people. Things like high copper, low zinc, low B6, pyrrole disorder, which is another condition that we check with a urine test that causes a severe depletion of zinc and B6. And when zinc and B6 get really low, it's very difficult to then make things like serotonin and dopamine and GABA and all of these neurotransmitters that actually cause us to feel relaxed and calm and feel good. So if those things can get balanced out, it lets our body get back into a more balanced state naturally. Now, with perceived stress, what we really need to do is emotional content tends to it's like it bubbles up. If we're not burning it off, it just boils up like a cauldron. And then before you know it, like everything's dripping over the edges, and we start to feel like we are irritable and we're angry and we're sad and we're overwhelmed and we're pissed off, and it's like all this stuff is happening at the same time, and it's hard to get any sort of balance as to how do we start to deal with life more effectively. So and Candace Pert used to talk, who wrote the book called Molecules of Emotion, would talk about how the neurochemistry of emotions, the neuropeptides that are formed when we feel a certain type of stressor. So if we feel angry, there's a certain neuropeptide that's created in the body. If we feel sad, there's a certain neuropeptide. And so these neuropeptides build up and basically get stored in the body until they get burnt off. And these emotions in our nervous system are very interrelated. I often think of the way we deal with emotions in a very similar way to how this fight or flight response is. So when we're in fight, I think of it like this. When one of the ways that we work with emotions when we're in fight is it's like we add intensity to the emotion. So we tend to go deeper into the storyline that triggered the feeling in the first place. So someone cuts us off in traffic, and rather than being able to kind of let it go, we tend to get into a deeper story about what a jackass the person is, and how could they be so rude, and how could they be so this and that, and we ruminate on it, and we just build it up into something bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like taking an ember and adding a whole bunch of dry grass and sticks to it until it becomes a big forest fire. And then it's a lot harder to deal with. When I think about flight, the other way that we deal with emotions, or I should say that we don't really deal with emotions, is we kind of run away from them. It's like the feeling of it is so intense and so uncomfortable that we just want to distract ourselves from the intensity of the emotion. So, and right now we have umpteen million ways to distract ourselves from emotions. We can go on Netflix, we can Google something, we can do just about anything we want to try and distract ourselves from feeling what's going on in the body. Now, sometimes distraction can definitely be a good thing. Sometimes we need a bit of a break from stuff. But if we're always distracting and sort of never allowing ourselves to really authentically feel what is going on in the body, we're never giving ourselves a chance to resolve that emotional content that's sitting there, allowing the neuropeptides to actually burn up so we don't feel that intensity so much anymore. And then the freeze I think of is when we feel like we're a deer in headlights and we're just stuck and standing there and just wish that we were somewhere else doing something different altogether. It's almost that feeling of numbness where we just don't feel anything anymore. And sometimes I've heard people explain it to me, they're like, I feel either enraged or indifferent and almost nothing in between. And you can flip super quickly. So these are the ways I think about the emotions when they start to build up because we're not really processing them effectively. Now, one of my favorite exercises to working with emotions is an exercise that we got taught by a Buddhist nun called Pema Chodron. And you Google in Pema Chodron and you will see umpteen million books that she's written. She's a real avatar in bringing Buddhist teachings in a very real Western way. And she's funny and she's very real, and it's really neat practice. And what I like about some of the teachings is that this one she called FEAR. So the acronym was FEAR. And these different letters stand for something. And the whole idea is that emotions need to be felt to some degree. Now, the intensity of it and the duration of it is individual. Sometimes you need to just touch in and feel it and then come back out of it so that you don't feel overwhelmed by it. Sometimes you can stay with it a little bit longer. And I remember the first time that I started to really practice this exercise was after going through a really hard breakup quite some time back, over a decade ago. And it was a very challenging one. And actually, this was, gosh, the first time I did this was probably close to 20 years ago. And I remember taking the time off in the summer when I was out of school and working in the summer. And almost every day I went to the park and I did this exercise. And I did it as a walking meditation. And the feelings inside were just intense to the point where you just can't get your head out of thinking almost about anything else other than what it is that you're stressed about. And I don't know if anybody's gone through that, but if they have, I feel you because I know exactly what that can feel like. The only reprieve I would get would be if I would go to the gym for about 2 hours and work out as hard as I could, and I could get a bit of a reprieve, and then on my walk back home, the thoughts would start to come back in again. And so this exercise brings you back to trying to feel and just stay with sensation. Because the problem is that we get caught up with when we get sensation, our brain kicks in and then it ties into a story. And the story builds everything up into something more. And then that becomes almost impossible to work with. So what we're trying to work with is that first trigger of sensation. And if we can stay with sensation and let that run its course, it does run its course. The feeling starts to run its course. So in this exercise called FEAR, the F stands for feel it in your body. So you make the sensation. So for example, say I'm feeling worried. Okay, say the sensation is worry. So the first thing I'm going to do is go, okay, what am I actually feeling? So I slow things down, or maybe I do a bit of a walking meditation in the park where I just slow things down and then I start to ask what I'm feeling and where I'm feeling it. And so I might say, okay, well, where am I feeling this sensation of worry? Right away, I might get an inkling that it's around my solar plexus. And I might feel like this butterflies in my stomach, or I feel maybe a little bit of heaviness in my chest. Sometimes maybe it's tension. I feel achiness in my shoulders. I feel heaviness in my arms. I might just go through and I'm being very inquisitive and curious as to what sensation, how does this feeling of worry show up in my body? What does it feel like? And then the E stands for embracing that feeling. Because a lot of times we don't like the sensation of it. And that's usually what causes us to distract, or it causes us to make it even more and get into the storyline that's connected to it. But the goal is to just feel it in your body and then welcome it in with open arms. Which sounds kind of funny because a lot of times we don't like these sensations, but we have to go through it. We really do have to go through these sensations in order to get to the other side. And embracing the feeling then is sort of openly and willingly allowing yourself to go into it with a mindset that's curious. And that's really important because when you're curious, you're not so scared anymore. You're not so worried. You're more curious as to how does this show up in my body? What else? What else is there? What else is there? That's the kind of questions you're asking yourself. Now, remember that when you start to feel this sensation, which your body has usually been accustomed to for a long time, but maybe hasn't sat with it in this way before, that sensation triggers thoughts. There's a storyline that goes with how our body feels. And so the A stands for allow the thoughts to dissolve. So you might first get this feeling of worry, right? And you're describing what it feels like inside the body physically. But then what will happen very quickly is the brain will sort of go, oh, right, well, I'm worried because of this and this and this, and then this might happen, and then, oh my gosh, and then what's going to happen after this? And you're already down the rabbit hole, and you've just caused this ember of a sensation to now become a bigger forest fire that's a lot harder to put out. So you have to keep reminding yourself, whoa, whoa, that's thinking. I'm not thinking right now. I am only going to feel. I'm just feeling sensation. I'm not thinking. Come back to feeling. What am I feeling? What is my body feeling like? And sometimes when you're doing a bit of a walking meditation, meaning like go for a walk in the park. Maybe if you can, it's a clean park, take your shoes off and walk on the grass and just feel the grass on your feet. Like get grounded, more present, and then keep coming back to sensation of what this is like. And then if you can stay with these sensations long enough, often they start to dissolve. Now, how the Buddhist teachings would talk about, they would say that if you stay with these sensations of discomfort, they naturally transition into feelings of openness, awareness, and warmth. And I've experienced that firsthand, where if I've stayed with it long enough without making it anything else, they automatically just kind of change. It's like the neuropeptides get burnt up and they dissolve. And Dr. What's her name? Dr. Bolt Taylor, who wrote A Stroke of Insight, she talked about the neuropeptides, and she said that ultimately it takes about 2 minutes for the neurochemistry of emotions to dissolve and move on. But most of the time, because we keep thinking about it, we keep re-triggering the process over and over and over again, so we never allow them to really let go. And so if we can feel it in the body and stay with the sensation without making it anything else, think of it like a really simple ember that if you didn't blow on it, if you didn't add anything to it, it would just dissolve out on its own. That's what we're trying to do with emotions. And then once it kind of dissolves, then the R is to remember the millions of others going through similar experiences. And what I think is unique, or I think what is really neat about this is that we're all, if you're human, you're going to go through suffering. We all will. And when we go through some sorts of suffering, we tend to feel like we're alone in it and that it's all encompassing. And what's important to remember is that even if it's intense for us, it doesn't necessarily mean it's completely unique, that we all go through it. And to know that other people are going through it as well, there's something about that that just sets a little bit of ease for us, knowing that we're not alone in these things. And often what makes me feel like is it's almost like I can take one for the team. I think of it a little bit like if I'm going through this and if I can get through it and come out the other side, I feel like I'm setting something out there for others that it can be possible, even if that's just purely on an energetic plane. So that's the practice, and I think when you start with little ones. Don't start with the biggest stressor that you've got, like you've got a huge stressor with your partner or with your parents or a big financial stressor or something like that. That just might be too intense right off the bat. So what you would be better off to start with would be maybe little ones, like when you're lined up in a line and it's taking a little bit longer than it should to get your coffee in the morning. And so you're starting to feel impatient or a little bit irritable, or someone cuts in front of you in traffic. Well, maybe that's not a good one to start with because sometimes that can be a pretty intense one for people. But I usually think start with minor irritabilities and minor impatiences. So you build some spiritual muscle to be able to handle the big ones because it's practice. As you practice it, you start to get better with it. As you get better with it, you can take on more. And then eventually what happens is the big stressors hit and you don't go down the rabbit hole as nearly as fast and you can deal with them a lot better. A way that I think about this is wherever we are feeling, and why this affects our life so much, and it affects our health in so many ways too, because some of the work by a really amazing avatar in the field of consciousness was Dr. David Hawkins, MD, PhD. And he did a lot of work, and one of his groundbreaking books was called Truth versus Falsehood and Power versus Force. And he looked at a scale of consciousness. And it's very much based on then what the emotion is tied to these different levels of consciousness. And when he talks about power versus force, what he's talking about is that different emotional states have more inherent power in them to affect our lives. And other emotional states have a lower level of power where it's harder to affect our lives in a positive way. So his scale goes everywhere from 20 all the way up to 100. And I'm going to go from the lowest up to the highest. And I'll give you the numeric value that he attributed to each one of these. And remember, this is a level of power. So the lower the number, the less ability to start to make real changes in your life in a positive direction. So down at 20 points would be shame. Then you move up to guilt at 30. Apathy and hatred would be at 50. Grief would be at 75. Fear is at 100. Desire is at 125. Anger at 150. Pride at 175. Now, all of those are below the level of 200. And according to Dr. David Hawkins, you need to get above 200 to start to have life-affirming effects. So once you start to get to 200, which is at the level of courage. So you need to have a certain level of courage in order to start to make positive changes in your world. And the higher your level of consciousness, the more that you can actually influence the world around you. 250 would be neutrality. At 310, you move into willingness. At 350, to the feelings of acceptance. At 400, there's reason. And then you move into these upper levels of very high emotions that very few people get to really live in. And this will be the feeling of love. At 500, at 540 would be pure unconditional love and joy. At the level of 600 is peace. And then up from 600 up, you're moving into different levels of enlightenment. Now, why I find this useful is because how I think of these different levels of consciousness, they're like the lens that you put over your eyes. If you are feeling angry for whatever reason, then you see an angry world. And so much of what I'm trying to get across to people is we need to work on our inner world so that we change our outer world. Whereas so much stuff is based around how do we change the outer world so it doesn't affect me so much. And what we really need to do and what we only really have power around is changing our inner world so that we can handle our outer world. And then we start to make different choices and then we adapt and we change what we want our outer world to be like from a more powerful place. But if we are in a feeling of anger, if we, think about someone that you maybe know that's very bitter, angry, resentful, they see a resentful world. They see an angry world. The world that they are looking at feels like that. People are out to get them, right? They're going to be cheated. These are the things that they think about because that's the lens that they're seeing the world with. And most of the time it's because of just upbringing and history of events and what's gone on in their life that's what painted their lens. And it ties into a lot of beliefs. But then think of maybe a time where you fell head over heels in love for the first time. And boom, you get catapulted up to a very different level. And now that is likely not pure level of consciousness of 500. That's a very pure form of love. A lot of times our adolescent love is a little bit different than that. But think about still the feeling when you fell in love. Almost instantly, the world looks very different around you. The things that maybe bothered you at one point just didn't seem to bother you anymore, right? Or if something happened and you got some amazing news about finances or something like that, all of a sudden the things that were right there before that made you feel a certain way might all of a sudden not look that way anymore. You won the lottery or something along those lines. Or someone sent you a letter of just how much they appreciated you in your life and you got this big burst of appreciation. All of a sudden you find that the way that you look at things around you is very different. Now, nothing actually changed outside of that, but your perspective on it completely shifted. So when I think about it like this, again, you want to try and figure out if you are sitting for too long in things like guilt or fear or grief or some of these lower power emotions. We need to be able to feel them and use them as learning and figure out what we can do with them. But ultimately, you don't want to be living in them all the time. We want to be able to burn through them and move to something that's going to be more supportive for our lives. And if you stay in these lower energy emotions under 200, that you're also going to be running into more troubles with ill health, because these things are more tied to stress response. And the neurochemistry for these types of emotions below 200 is going to cause more troubles. It usually sets up and turns on epigenetics that cause more disease, as opposed to when you move to the emotions above 200, they tend to turn on epigenetics that support health and longevity. Now, I want to finish it in this old teaching called the 2 arrows of suffering. And now, actually, Rod Stryker in one of the interviews corrected me on this. He said, I think he said it was the 10,000 arrows of suffering. And I always thought of it as the 2 arrows of suffering. So the idea, though, I'm going to do it as 2 arrows of suffering and explain the idea here. Suffering, if you are human and we are on this planet at this point in time, and you are having a human experience, you are going to go through suffering. The bottom line is that relationships end, people die, we lose jobs, there's financial things, there's lots of different stressors that we're going to come across. That's what the first arrow is. The first arrow is the event that triggered the original suffering, which is normal. It's a part of having a human experience. We're not supposed to live a life with no suffering. Suffering is inherent. But what we have control over is the second arrow. And the second arrow is the arrow that we constantly shoot ourselves with over and over and over again. And that's what usually is what is related to these chronic cycles of stress. When we get caught up in stories and we can't let go and we can't forgive, those are the things that cause this second arrow that we just keep shooting ourselves with over and over and over again. And that is what causes most of the trouble. When we do exercises like that fear exercise, where we try to just sit with the emotion and let them start to dissolve, it lowers our load of this emotional stress hormones, these emotional peptides that are sitting in our body. We start to dissolve some of that so that we can actually start to maybe see things a little bit differently. You have to be able to feel sensation of emotions, let them burn themselves out and resolve, so that we can now actually start to feel something different and authentically start to see life a little bit differently. Because until that emotion starts to dissolve and it's no longer there as the lens that we're seeing everything through, we're just going to keep seeing it the same way. And then we're trying to convince ourselves to see it differently, but it just doesn't feel right. But if that feeling state changes, then our perspective starts to automatically change with it. So in conclusion, 4 big areas. We just went through perceived stress, gave you some tools on how to start to work with that and think about it. We looked at blood sugar stability, lots of stuff around that. Easy one to start to work with, probably one of the easiest ones to start to get on track right away. We talked about inflammation and a lot of things you can do to start to minimize inflammation. There's ways to test for it too, if you want to test for it and see where you are so that you've got a benchmark. And then there's circadian rhythm, getting your sleep-wake cycle starting to get dialed back in. You get all of these things back on track and you will dramatically improve that psycho-neuro-immunological response. Stress affects our nervous system, which affects our immune system. So we cannot talk about immunity without focusing on getting stress to get dialed in, and then we start to heal. Thanks very much, guys, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.